the chairs today. That means we'll have to visit each other. Men. It is August the 1st also, and remember this is the month of 5 Sundays. And the last Sunday, we take up the extra contribution for the people in need here. And it's been helpful, and there's been a lot of needs the last year or two, so let's start preparing 4 more weeks to do that. If you're visiting, we've had a series of lessons on good lessons from bad guys. And this week and the next 2, we're talking about some bad gals. And today especially one that let herself be embarrassed about what her husband was doing. So, Kevin, let's see what it's all about.
Well, Tom Kuhn has told me that we needed to equal this thing out and quit talking about all the bad guys. Let's talk about some of the bad women for a while. I don't know what that was about. I'm not really sure. Is there something that we need?
I'll find out later.
Yeah. Wait till he gets in the car.
Thank you.
I'm helping Tom. We are glad that you're here this morning, and glad for the folks who are with us streaming as well. Always glad to have this group together. Let me mention, last week we talked about Lucy, and several of you helped in that, and others did as well. In her situation, they do have some furniture now, which is good. They have moved into a different place, and maybe a safer place, we think. And so we're really grateful for all the response towards her and her family. Who knows? This may give us an opportunity to be able to study with him as well, her husband. So that would be wonderful. A little bit of a twist today when we start talking about a girl instead of a guy in this particular situation, but you'll see that we're looking at Michal and looking at this characteristic of her that is mentioned in 2 Samuel chapter 6. We'll be there in just a little bit, but got a couple of questions for us as we begin. Okay, come on, let's see if it'll work. There, it's going to work. Several years ago, they did one of those surveys where they go around talking to everyone, and probably 30, 40 years ago, what would you have thought was the most popular verse that people here in America would know? Not talking necessarily just about Christians, but just people in general. Yeah, several different of you said. John 3:16, God so loved the world, right? Do you think that's the same verse that people in general know today? They did another survey, and that's not the verse that most people know today. Most people know this one a little bit more. Right? Don't you judge me. Don't you tell me I'm wrong. Don't you tell me that what I'm doing is not okay with God. I'm going to be who I'm going to be, and God's just got to be okay with that. Seems to be more the idea, right? If you say anything about me, you're being bigoted, or you're being intolerant, or you're being whatever, right? And tolerance seems to be the word now. But tolerance means something different now than it did some years ago. Some years ago, tolerance meant that you allowed people to believe kind of what they wanted to believe. You can choose to believe that. Now, I may disagree with you, and I may say that I disagree with you, but now tolerance means not only do you allow me to say that I believe this, you need to believe it with me. You need to be okay with me believing this. You need to be in agreement with me believing this. That's a whole different view of tolerance, isn't it? That's a whole different idea here. Because any kind of judgment, any kind, you're being intolerant. You're not being nice. In fact, they will look at us as Christians and they know that we don't want to be judgmental, as we're going to talk about today. We don't want to be accused of being, the kind of people that go around judging everybody and telling everybody that they're wrong and we're all glad they're going to hell. We don't want to be that kind of person. So when they say those things about us, that tends to back us up pretty quick, doesn't it? I'll just keep my mouth shut. I just won't say anything. I just won't be that kind of person. And so it seems, particularly with the unchurched, that Matthew 7 verse 1 seems to be the one that is so important. Now, that whole section and that whole context is different, especially if you really start looking at the context, right? That whole context deals with logs and dogs and hogs. And you're going, wait a minute, I got to go back over there. Yeah, no, really. The log in the eye, right? Yes. Throwing pearls before swine, there's your hogs, and dogs, right? Not only the little puppy doggies, but also the wolves in sheep's clothing. Do you have to be able to know the difference between sheep and wolves? Is Jesus teaching that there? Isn't he? Do you have to know the difference between pearls and rocks or something else? Shouldn't you? Don't you need to know if there is the difference between a log in somebody's eye and a speck of dust? Isn't there some judgment that's given to us that we are responsible for? And I think that whole section right there is proof of that. When he mentions in verse 1, it's the idea of what kind of judging are we doing. That's the key for what we're going to be looking at today. What kind of judging is wrong and what kind of judging is actually helpful? And there are some that are helpful, okay? In fact, before we get through with this lesson, my guess is most of us are going to form an opinion about Michal. Isn't that a judgment? It is, isn't it? Most of us are going to look at the difference between David and Michal in this story, and we're going to decide between the two which one was okay with God and which one was not. Yes? In fact, we do that almost every time we get together in a class, don't we? And so, again, when we start looking at judgment, we need to answer the question, what kind of judgment are we talking about here? Well, let's give it a little background to the story here and what we're talking about, okay? Who is this lady, Michal? Well, she's always talked about as the daughter of King Saul. And so if she is the daughter of King Saul, she's a princess, right? Is she a daddy's girl? Not a whole lot is given to us about her upbringing, but if she is raised in the palace, what kind of niceties, I don't know, what kind of things is she used to if she's raised in the palace? What would you think?
The best.
The best? The best what? What? Of everything. Food, clothes. She has to live in a palace, right? Pretty tough. So when we look at her, she is used to a certain style of living. Okay? Now, we'll talk a little bit more about this, but when she marries David, is David king yet? Is he rich yet? Does he have all the things that Daddy has? You think that might have caused a few conversations when they were in the car on the way home, Tom? Think there might have been a few conversations there? You know, the chariot ride back to the house. So, princess, right? Raised in the palace. But you also find out, and these are some of the other passages, we're not going to look at all those today, but some of the other passages, she's also mentioned in chapter 18, verses 20 through 28. And David has already been offered the oldest daughter, Merab, and David says, you know, I'm not worthy to be the king's son-in-law, basically. And so chooses not to do that. But what you find out, particularly the reason that I use the word pawn right here, is because when Saul finds out that she loves David, he thinks to himself, aha, This is my opportunity to get to David. And I'll use my daughter to do that. Now, that's a really nice dad, isn't it? But isn't that kind of Saul's MO anyway? Isn't that kind of the way that he works? It's like, I'm going to use whoever, for his own benefit. Because what's he want with David? What's he want to do to David?
Kill him.
Yeah, exactly. Let's get rid of him. Let's get rid of David. Let's do everything we can, and I'll use her as the word that's used in the New American Standard is a snare. And I'll use it in such a way, I will say the way that what I want here is 1,000 foreskins from the Philistines. Now, we don't like to talk about that in mixed company very much. But the way that you get 100 foreskins is you kill the 100 Philistines, right? And he's thinking, okay, 1 against 100, David's going to die. Yes? Well, David ends up killing 200 and bringing them and ends up marrying Michal. Okay? But again, she's still used as a pawn. She's also mentioned a little bit later in chapter 19 as a protector. Typically, when we think of this story and we think about the story of Saul and David, who is the protector in the family of David? Who do you think of almost immediately? In Saul's family? Jonathan, right? You remember that? You remember so much of the story of Jonathan is he's always protecting David, right? He is always looking out for him to the point that Saul even tries to pin him to the wall with a spear. It's not just David, he tries to do that with his own son Jonathan, right? And so when you look at the story, we don't typically think about Michal doing that. But there are several things that go on in this. Saul sees that the Lord was with David. He also sees that Michal loved David, and so he's going to use her in that, but he orders everyone that serves him to kill David. Anybody. It doesn't matter who. He tries to spear him, pin him to the wall with the spear. David runs out of the palace. Saul thinks he's going to go home. Makes sense, right? And so he sends guards to the house where David and Michal live. Now, what did Michal do? You remember the story?
She let him out the window.
But first, what does she do? Before she lets him out the window, and she does let him out the window to help him escape, what does she do? He's ill, right? Now, how do you know that he's ill? Well, he's in bed. But what's actually in the bed? She puts a household idol in the bed, puts goat's hair on top of the idol right here, and says, see, he's sleeping over there. And they finally go over and notice and, pull back the covers, and there's an idol. Must be pretty good size if you think it's the size of a man, right? With goat's hair on it. And they report that to Saul. Okay? Another time we find Michal is in chapter 25 at the end of 1 Samuel. Now that David is on the run from Saul and everybody in Saul's group is basically trying to kill David, where's he going? Anywhere and everywhere to stay away from Saul, right? He's on the run. He's constantly going from here to here. He can't live anywhere in one place. So what does Saul decide to do? I'll take Michal and I'll give her to somebody else. And he does. A man named Palti. And it doesn't give us any of the background really of Palti. It doesn't tell us anything about him. Is he a good man or a bad man? Doesn't really give us a lot to talk about with him. But one thing happens. We don't find this out except in and around the story of Abigail and Nabal. Now, who was Nabal? What's the word that's always used about him? Fool. And the reason for it is his name means fool. Right? Mom and Daddy either didn't like this little boy very much, or that name came to mean fool after he became, the kind of person that he was. What happens with Nabal? He dies. What does David do with Abigail? Marries her. Now you've got two women in the house, or two ladies married to David, right? And in that conversation, then it says at that particular time, Saul had already given Michal to Palti. Okay? Interesting that it's in that context. One more time you find in 2 Samuel, before we get to chapter 6, but in chapter 3, Saul and Jonathan have both been killed. Bodies have been hung up on the wall of Bethshan. You've got this situation where David is mourning over that. Abner, the commander of Saul's army, comes to David, moves to David's side. Ishbosheth, one of Saul's sons, also pledges his allegiance to David as well, and they make a covenant. One of the things that David says is, if this is real and if you really are on my side now, bring Michal back to me. She was my wife, so bring her back. Well, in that story it says that Palti followed after her like a whipped pup. Please don't leave, please don't leave, please don't. And finally he has to look at him and say, go home. Okay? This is decided, it's already over, forget it. And so that's a little bit of the background behind all that. But you think about that, it seems like now you're going to have 2 women in the house. Is that going to go well? It always goes well, doesn't it? We know some of the other stories. So from chapter 3 there in 2 Samuel, there are some things that take place as we look at David. David becomes king over all of Israel, right? Saul and Jonathan are dead. The Philistines have killed them. He has a desire, David does, to restore and even strengthen worship of Jehovah God. Now tell me about Saul. Is Saul a believer in God? Yeah, kind of, sort of. But is he anything like David, whose heart was fully devoted to God? No, it seems as if Saul's view of God is he's to be used as well. He's kind of like anything else. He's a good luck charm, or he's a pawn. I can use him however I want to, and if I don't like the things that God tells me, then I'll do what I want to do. Right? So David's desire is to make sure that things are, and to do that, he decides he's going to bring the Ark of the Covenant. What's the Ark of the Covenant? What's the reminder in the Ark of the Covenant?
The law.
The law is inside, the 10 Commandments, remember? And it is the reminder of the covenant that they have with God. Do you think Saul emphasized the Ark of the Covenant very much in his reign?
It wasn't even, didn't even move out of the guy's house.
No, it's like here, you take it somewhere else, and Saul actually, the way that he dies, you remember, is he takes the Ark of the Covenant and uses it kind of as a good luck charm. That didn't really go very well. The first attempt in the beginning of chapter 6 doesn't really go well. You remember the story? Do you remember what happens in the beginning of chapter 6? What was his name? Uzzah. Who is Uzzah?
He's the son of Abinadab with the ark on.
Oh, good. Okay. What do we remember about Uzzah?
Tried to steady the ark.
Yeah, first of all, David wants to bring the ark back. Does he do it in the way that's prescribed? Does he do it in the way that God has said, carry the ark? How are they supposed to carry the ark? Remember the poles? And the guys are supposed to carry the ends of the poles and bring the ark back. Does David do that? No, he says, I'll build a brand new cart, and I'll bring it in on the cart right here, and everybody will be rejoicing. Everything will be good, right? But it hits a rock or a rut or something and begins to teeter, and what does Uzzah do? He puts his hand up there to steady it, and God immediately strikes him dead in front of everybody. What's David's response? He gets angry, and he gets really afraid. Both of those things. He is both angry with God and angry at what took place because God would do this, but he's also afraid of God now. And so for 3 months, it stays at Obed-Edom's house. But what happens with Obed-Edom and his household is for 3 months, it is very, very noticeable that God is blessing him. Now, how much does God have to bless somebody that in 3 months' time, that report gets back to the king? That's a pretty noticeable thing, don't you imagine? That's not just a few better things are going on. Something big is going on that everybody notices. And so David says, hey, let's bring the ark back into Jerusalem. Okay? All right, let's do a little bit of reading. And let's talk about the procession or the parade that's about to take place. Let's start in verse 12. Chapter 6, 2 Samuel, beginning in verse 12. Now it was told King David, saying, the Lord has blessed the house of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him on account of the ark of God. David went and brought up the ark of God from the house of Obed-Edom into the city of David with gladness. And so it was that when the bearers of the ark, what does that tell you? Did he get it right this time? He got it right the second time, didn't he? The bearers of the ark of the Lord had gone 6 paces. He sacrificed an ox and a fatling. Now, how much gladness is in David's heart? And sacrifice is a part of this as well. Yes? And David was dancing before the Lord with all his might, and David was wearing a linen ephod. Okay? All right. A couple of things that come out of this. What is David's focus here? And that's important, guys. Is David's focus upon himself? Where's his focus? It's all about God, isn't it? In fact, when it talks about his dancing, what's the phrase that's used to talk about his dance? What? With all his heart, all his might, or strength, some say. Okay? That's going to be key. We're going to look at that here in a little bit, but that's going to be really key. So he danced with all his might. The bearers have done it. The sacrifice has taken place. David and all Israel. Now, if you go back and look at the first part of chapter 6, the first time David brought with him 30,000 people to celebrate. Do you think there were fewer at the second time? My guess is probably not. So are we just talking about a little procession here, a little parade, or 30,000 folks or more? Is this a big deal? Bringing the Ark of the Covenant in Jerusalem, that's a big thing, isn't it? That's huge. And he wants to make sure that everybody else is involved with this as well. So what's going on? Dancing, shouting, trumpets blaring. Why would you do, especially with the trumpets, what would be the point of trumpets blaring and people shouting? Huh? I heard it. Yes. That's all about attention, isn't it? Everybody needs to pay attention to what's taking place right here. This is a big thing. This is a big deal. You need to be watching. You need to be paying attention. God is coming back to be center place in the worship of Israel. Not just for David, but for everyone. But back to the phrase, he danced with all his might. What about his dancing? Kip and I were talking a little bit before here that the Old King James doesn't do us a lot of favors sometimes when it says in the Old King James he danced naked. No, he didn't. Okay? Did he probably show more of his leg than he thought he was? Perhaps. It sure seems that Michael thinks so, and that he's showing off or showing out. My mom used to say, just showing out. Okay? We get concerned about his dancing. We get concerned about his dress. But listen, what is his desire? Say it loud, Jerry.
To honor God.
Where's his focus? Is it about him? Is David trying to honor himself? Is he trying to let everybody know that he's the big king? His focus is not on himself as king, but on the king. Yes? His focus is on the king, and he wants everybody else to notice the king as well. A couple of phrases that are interesting to me. With all of his might. Tell me again in Matthew chapter 22, when the lawyer comes to Jesus, he asks him a question. What's the greatest command? You remember that, right? What's the greatest command? Love God with what? Heart, soul, mind in 22, but Deuteronomy, the original, all your might, all your strength. But that sounds different than mind, doesn't it? Acts chapter 3, verse 8. That whole section of Acts chapter 3. You remember when they go Peter and John go to the temple, and they have to kind of either step over or step around the guy who's there begging for money. Remember? He's been lame forever and ever. All he's looking for is a little bit of money. Peter gives him a whole lot more than money, doesn't he? What's this guy do when Peter says, in the name of the Lord Jesus, stand up? What's he do? He jumps for joy. What does that look like, you think? If a guy hasn't been able to walk for years, what does jumping for joy look like? You think?
It may not be very dignified.
Hank said over here, guys, it may not be very dignified.
If you watched an Olympic person win and they showed back the whole
Oh,
I mean, they were hitting the ceiling.
good. Good. I hadn't thought about that particular illustration. But this guy, not only is he jumping there, what does he do? He messes up their worship service, doesn't he? Why? He goes into the temple doing the same thing. And he's shouting and jumping for joy. And that'll mess up a church service, won't it? Right there. I guess unless you're, no, let's leave it alone. No, leave it alone, Kevin. Stay away. Yeah, I know it isn't. Don't say that. The point I'm trying to make here is David's focus is not on himself. Where's his focus? This is all about God, isn't it? All about God. And he wants to bring the focus back on God and back on the ark. Okay? And I had all those things written down, but I got busy talking. So, all right. Look at verses 15 through 19 with me. And here you have Michael presuming some things about David. You have what I've called the presumption here. Okay? It says, so David and all the house of Israel were bringing up the ark of the Lord with shouting and the sound of the trumpet. It happened as the ark of the Lord came into the city of David that Michal, the daughter of Saul, looked out of the window and saw King David leaping and dancing before the Lord. And she, my version says, despised him in her heart. Any other versions? Any other phrase used there? Okay. Despised him in her heart. So they brought in the ark of the Lord and set it in its place inside the tent which David had pitched for it, and David offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. When David had finished offering the burnt offering and the peace offering, he blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. Further, he distributed to all the people, to all the multitude of Israel, both to men and women, a cake of bread and one of dates and one of raisins to each one. Then all the people departed, each to his house. Let's talk about a couple of things here for just a moment. The way that this begins, it seems in verse 16, then it happened. We use that word happened as just, it occurred. It's an event. But we also use that same word in the original as perhaps. The second part of that, which means what? It may happen. Another word that we use from that is happenstance, right? Even our word happiness comes from that, which means that everything has to fall into place for this to happen, for this to occur, okay? It doesn't seem that David was designing this, that he had a playbook and he's running down the list right here, and so I'm going to show off in front of everybody. It's not that he thought this through and planned it. But she despised him in her heart. So let's ask a couple of questions right here. Was she able to see into his heart? Can any of us see into another person's heart? Some of us have been married for a long time. And about the time I think I know what Danny's thinking, I get smacked upside the head and I was like, okay, that's not what I thought you were going to say at all. Has that ever happened to you before? Does she know what David is thinking? No, she just sees what he's doing, right? She sees King David, What was the word that was used before? Not acting very, what was the word? Dignified? Is he acting like a king? She knows what a king's supposed to look like. She was raised in the palace. What's the king supposed to do? He's supposed to come out in his nice, flowing robes and speak, speeches to everybody. Is that what David's doing?
If you put on the ephod, he took off the robe.
Okay, that's another part of this. It seems like all the royal robes are gone. Why? Think about that for a moment. Why would he take off the royal robes? Again, the focus is not on him, is it? What does he want people looking at? The Ark of the Covenant. Why? Because that is where God dwells here on this planet. Yes? That's who God is. I want all the focus to be on him, and I want everybody else to be focused on him as well. Could she see his joy? Does she understand his praise? In fact, you might want to ask the question, is the Ark of the Covenant anything at all to her? Hang on to that thought for a moment. We're going to come back to that in a little bit. Okay? We've already hit on it. Maybe some of you are already ahead of me here a little bit. But there's something about the Ark of the Covenant, and at least her view maybe of it. I've always wondered about their relationship. What do you think their relationship is like at this particular point? If she has been married to another man, doesn't say how long, months, years, but now she's brought back into the palace. David asks for her, right? He does that. But is there a little bit of a strain in the relationship? Perhaps. But I've always wondered about that relationship at this particular time. She is really, really concerned about how other people are viewing him. You know, those girls are watching you out there, David. Are they lusting after her husband? Is she, as the wife of David, the first wife of David, is she queen again when she comes back into the house? Because Abigail's there too now. Again, not given a lot of information about that, but makes you wonder. The one thing that you find out when she despises him in her heart, now who's she like? That was the way her father looked at David, wasn't it? Yes? That's exactly what Saul. He hated David so much that he's willing to kill him and to send everybody else on his team after David. I don't care about anybody else, just go get David. Her heart is now like Saul's, utter contempt, hatred, abhorring this man and the things that he's done. Well, look at verse 20 with me. Here you have her protest. When David returned to bless his household, Michal, the daughter of Saul, came out to meet David. She doesn't even let him in the house. That's one of those things, remember my dad used to talk about, you throw your hat in the house and if it doesn't come back, it's okay to come in. He doesn't get in the house before she shows up on the front porch. I don't know what the picture is, but if my mom is any, it's hands on the hips. Right, ladies? When the hands go on the hips, guys, what happens? You better run. But in this particular case, she meets him before he ever gets to in the door. How the king of Israel distinguished himself today. He uncovered himself today in the eyes of his servants' maids as one of the foolish ones shamelessly uncovers himself. I'm not a smart man, but I think if the wife said something like that to me, I'd figure out things aren't good, right? Guys, we'd figure it out real quick, wouldn't we? You shamed yourself, David. You dishonored yourself, is what she's saying. Now, she uses the word distinguish, but you know she's meaning just the opposite, right? Again, where is David's focus as all this is taking place as he brings the ark into Jerusalem? In his mind, it's all about God, isn't it? In fact, when we talk about the ephod that he is wearing, that's the clothing of a priest. He's not wearing the clothing of a king. Interesting. He doesn't want to take the attention away from God in any way. Michael's focus, who is she concerned about? Herself. And why do you say that she's concerned about herself? See, she's going to be viewed, especially in the eyes of all these girls, right? Because of what she let David do. Yes? He's doing this. They're going to look down on me because of what you're doing. It isn't just about what David did. Now she's concerned about how people are going to see her as well. But a couple of things are true here, right? What had he just got through doing? He just blessed the Lord with all of this, right? All of this was for God's sake. All of this was praising God. All of this was recognizing God. More than that, he just blessed everybody in Jerusalem. I don't know how many people were there. I'm guessing a good number, don't you imagine? If there were 30,000 the first time, how many are there now?
All of the household of Israel.
Okay, how many pieces of bread, not just pieces of bread, how many loaves of bread is that? How many raisin cakes is that? How long does it take to distribute all of that to everyone that's out there? And why would you do that? Again, he's blessing God. God has blessed me, God has blessed us, and so he is in turn then blessing them too. Does this make them walk away with a smile on their face? I would think so, right? Look at David and look at what he's doing. Everybody's got a smile on their face except Michael. And she's not happy. Everybody else seems to be. Everybody else is walking away feeling pretty good. And now he's ready to go in and to bless his family. If he blesses everybody in Jerusalem with bread and raisins, what is he bringing? What does he have in his hands to bless his family? You think he's coming home empty-handed? I don't guess so. If he's blessing everybody else, I'm thinking they're going to get something too, right? But you have a wet blanket. You have a lady who looks at him judgmentally. I know what you were doing. I know what you were thinking. I know what you were trying to do. She is judgmental, and it sure seems like she is jealous. How does she talk about David? What does she compare him to? She uses that phrase like one of the foolish ones. Anybody else have another phrase? What? Vulgar. Whoa, that all of a sudden took a turn, didn't it? Anybody else have another phrase?
Vulgar could mean common.
Yes? Yes?
You're no better than the servant.
Oh. You're not acting very keenly here, are you? Let's take a look at this, and let's take a look at some of the words that are used right here. The English Standard, uses vulgar. The New Covenant Version uses the word foolish, like the New American Standard does. New King James, base, which is that idea, Ken, that you mentioned right here, common. Okay? You're like one of the common people. You're not any better than any of the rest. The Amplified Version says worthless. Wait a minute. How far has he fallen in Michael's eyes? It's really hard to get any lower than this, right? Particularly when she uses that word foolish. The New Living Translation says, like any indecent person. Yikes. The Contemporary English Version, like a dirty old man. Oh, I'm guessing that was a nice, quiet evening at home together, yes. So when we start looking at the way that she is talking to him, is she remembering who he is, first of all? In fact, that's where he's going to go here. In the next part of this, notice what he does here in verses 21 and following. He says, so David said to Michal, it was before the Lord who chose me above your father. Don't go so quickly to the father that you miss that first phrase. Who was this for? Who was all of this for? This parade, this procession, this bringing in. Who was that for? For himself? No, it was for the Lord. But it doesn't take him very long before he says, okay, let's do a little comparing if you want to. The Lord was the one who chose me above your father and above all his house. Now, who's a part of his house that he's talking to right there? Yes? What did he just do in just a couple of words? She's got him down here, she's got herself up here. What'd he do? Man, he flipped that pretty quick, didn't he? He chose me above your father and above all of his house to appoint me ruler over the people of the Lord, over Israel. Therefore I will celebrate before the Lord. And I will be more lightly esteemed than this, and will be humble in my own eyes. And with the maids of whom you have spoken, with them I will be distinguished. And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death. Wow. In this, David's not the one that says you'll not have children. It just says it in the text, doesn't it? But that does seem to be the punishment that God brings on her. Is it because David doesn't sleep with her anymore? The possibility is there, isn't it? Is it because he sends her to her room and says, stay there for the rest of your existence? Who knows? Is it that God just doesn't allow her to bear children? But ladies, we've talked about this before in class, right? What is it like in Bible times for a woman not to be able to have children? Huh? It's a shame. It's a disgrace. It is as if God doesn't love me, right? We've talked about that before with Sarah, Rebecca, Rachel, right? Exactly. Exactly. She will not be the one who brings the next, which was Solomon, right? So all of those things that you begin to look at, it's like you don't get to be a part of any of this. Something really big just happened here, didn't it? He also does something in comparison with her father. What's he say there in verse 21? Who did the choosing? David chose for himself to be king, right? No. God sent Samuel, you remember, to anoint David. He's not even in the room when Samuel gets to Jesse's house. Remember, he's out in the field and brings him in. It's God's choice. Now, something else, he says, over all Israel. Something important about that, because that was not always the case either. Remember, he's going to have to leave for a while, and for some years, he's going to be on the run, isn't he? And then he is brought back in. Over all Israel, that's a big phrase as well. And he says, even over your dad, he chose me. Now, I don't think David is patting himself on the back. He said, the Lord did all that. I didn't do any of that. I didn't deserve any of that, but God did the choosing, didn't he? On top of that, he says, I'm even going to be humbled more than this. Is he talking about others? Certainly that's going to happen. We talked about Shimei earlier in this study, and him throwing stones and dust in the air and cursing David and everything as he walks out. That comes after this. But I think she does more to disgrace David than even Shimei did. And you know those guys those people that you've badmouthed, those ladies you've badmouthed? Those people that you badmouthed, those ladies who were praising God because of me. They weren't praising me. They weren't patting me on the back. They weren't doing anything right here. They were praising God along with me. And you talk bad about them. They will honor me. And I'm not sure, but there isn't any other recorded words between David and Michal in the rest of Scripture. How'd you like that to be your last conversation with your spouse? How'd you like to have those be the last words that you hear? And so David basically says, you will be dishonored. He reminds her it was before the Lord. It was for his eyes. It was for his ears. It was for him, and it wasn't for you. Before we get away from this idea of judgmentalism, it isn't just Old Testament passages that talk about that, is it? In fact, you don't have to get very far into the New Testament. Romans is going to talk about it. There are other passages we'll look at here in a minute, but in Romans 14 and 15, that whole section begins with that idea, right? Don't accept the one who is weak in faith for the purpose of passing judgment on his opinions. Talks about the person who can eat all things, but some is only going to be a vegetarian, basically. You don't do these things. You don't look down with contempt on those folks who actually belong to God. They are God's people, not yours. They serve him. Doesn't that sound like the story of David as well? That David could have said the same thing? I was serving God, not serving you in this. I was lifting up my praise to God, not you in this. There are other passages that we're pretty familiar with as well, I think. Luke chapter 7, verse 39. Remember the story where Jesus is sitting there with Simon the Pharisee, and there's some buddies there, and a woman shows up. Remember what she does? Apparently she takes her hair down, which is already a bad thing in front of men. That's only supposed to take place in front of your husband. She takes her hair down, is crying so much she wets his feet with her tears. Well, now what are you going to do? She didn't bring a towel with her, so she uses her hair. Do you think if you looked at that, if kids were looking at that, do you think you'd look at that and say, Mom, you've gone too far? That's not very dignified. In fact, that was exactly the thinking that was going on inside of Simon's head, right? If he really were a prophet, he would know the kind of woman that she is. She's a sinner. Oh. And so not only is she judged by Simon, even Jesus is being judged here. Yes? A few chapters later, over in Luke chapter 18, it talks about the Pharisees, but particularly one Pharisee and a tax collector that both go to the temple to pray. Remember the story? And in that, Luke introduces this whole idea right here with that thought. These are the ones who viewed others with contempt. They're not like me. I'm better than they are. Judgmentalism. And even in Matthew chapter 26, verses 8 and 9, when Mary shows up, Matthew's not the one that gives us the phrase, or the name, John does, but when Mary shows up and anoints Jesus with that pure nard, that perfume, remember? And some of the disciples even argue and begin to discuss among themselves, why wasn't this sold and then the money given to the poor? John tells us it was Judas that instigated that conversation. Why would Judas be concerned about money?
Because he's the lover of money.
That's what he's always interested in, isn't it? Yes. Yeah. He's the one who had the money bag. So there are all kinds of New Testament passages that warn us as well. So what can we learn as we close down? What can we learn from this bad girl? It says at one time that Michal loved David. But I'm not really so sure that she was ever that in love with God. At least not like David. Why do I say that? Way she acted? Tell me about her religious upbringing. We know about Saul. What does she still have in the house? Did you catch that? Are we talking about a little bitty household idol? No, it's a household idol that's big enough that they think it's a body. It's similar to the size of David. So why is she thinking that the Ark of the Covenant is any big thing? Everybody's got different things like that. That's just your idol. Every time that you see her mentioned or introduced in another section, it's always Michal, the daughter of Saul. She was his daughter in more way than one, wasn't she? Her disposition, her view of David, her view of Jehovah God, her view of other women, everything. She is definitely the daughter of Saul, isn't she? We said before, could she see into his heart? There was one who could see into his heart. Remember when it talks about David in Scripture? He was a man after... Oh, is that the way she sees David? No. And so even in that, and she misunderstands what's going on with David, this dancing. He mentions it being humility and joyful humility, not arrogant showing off or showing out. She saw it as a person of the flesh wanting everybody to notice him, while David knew it was an expression of his spirit before the Lord. Some misunderstanding here, huh? But before we leave today, we need to ask ourselves some questions here. If humility and genuine worship go together, as in this particular story, why do they seem to be so often criticized and ridiculed? Can that happen to us? Boy, it got quiet in here all of a sudden. Can it happen to us? You see, I don't think this story is just for folks more than 3,000 years ago. We know it's in the New Testament as well, that they had problems in the New Testament. Even good, godly people had trouble with it, didn't they? And so is it possible for us to struggle with this also? But that's not proper, Kevin. You think it was proper for that woman to wipe Jesus' feet with her hair? You think people around the table thought it was proper? You think people thought it was proper for that guy in Acts chapter 3 jumping up and down and praising God and going into the temple and disturbing? You think that was viewed as proper? It's my guess. Most didn't think so. Tell him to hush. Quieten down. A life of worship should be enthusiastic. There are all kinds of passages. We don't have the time to look at that, but there are all kinds of passages that talk about people who cry out in joy, who are reverent in their behavior. But that's even an emotion, isn't it? Passionate, spirit-filled, fear and trembling, awesome, bowing low. All of those come from something inside us, yes? That moves us to act in a certain way. Joyful and enthusiastic. I think it was John Rissy used to say, we don't have to be a bunch of folks that look like we were baptized in pickle juice. What has God done for you? And are we so used to what God has done for us that we're scared to let anybody else know? We're glad about that. We're joyful about it. We're happy about that. Does that show up in our singing? Does it show up in our prayers? Does it show up in the way that we live our life for Him? And the last thing that I would say is, you be real careful. You, okay, including me in this as well. Be really, really cautious and careful about judging another's worship. The thing that you find in this is not only does she reject David in this, she looks at God and accuses him as well, doesn't she? You allowed that to take place, God? That's what's okay with you? You're all right with that? Is it easy for us to look around? Or they do things differently than I do. I don't know what that deal is with the hands up. Because maybe that's not us. Or the bowing to, somebody takes a knee in a prayer and we're going, is he okay? You know, did he fall down and can't get back up? Or 100 other things that we might talk about. Let's be real careful. Let's be real careful. Ready? Ma'am.
Most of us in here are the age that we remember the story of Brother Marshall Eagle,
Mm-hmm.
who said, by your fruits you shall know them. And he said, I'm not judging, I'm just approving.
Good.